Hi everyone, I'm Carl and I hope you're all doing well. In this video, we will be sculpting and painting this beholder variant. Beholders are a classic D&D monster, and I figured this miniature would also work well for a chaos spawn in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I originally started sculpting this for the January Encounter 10x10 challenge, but I didn't finish it in time, which isn't all that bad really, as I could work on it without rushing it. For those who are not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, beholders are floaty monsters with lots of eyes. Each eye has its own effect, ranging from hypnosis to straight up disintegrating stuff. They're also highly intelligent and make good antagonists because they will happily create organizations around themselves, with layers and layers of minions. Now, each beholder is fairly unique because of the weird way they reproduce. If beholders were in any way normal, then two beholders would love each other very much, they would get together and tiny beholders would happen. But no sir, beholders are not in any way normal, and hate the floaty guts of every member of their species that is not themselves. Sometimes a beholder will have a very special nightmare where they meet another beholder, and the idea upsets them so much that they accidentally break reality and cause a new beholder to pop into existence. And you thought you were socially awkward. Beholders have been part of Dungeons & Dragons long enough to leak into pop culture, like Futurama and Goblin Slayer. Their design changed out over the years, going from this whatever this is on the cover of Greyhawk back in the 70s, through to this thing in the early Monster Manual, to the gnarlier form in the 3rd edition. While the most recent design looks pretty neat, I still think it's not weird enough for an aberration. I mean, look at it. It has a face and stuff. So I started to design my own. The rest of this video will be about how I made this, but if you want to make your own in a more conventional pattern, you can hop over to my friend Earthmanbrick's channel and see how he made his. I started off with an empty stick of roll-on deodorant. Make sure it's really dry and empty or you will make a mess. You can usually pop the ball out fairly easily. Once you extract the ball, wash it in warm water to get rid of the residue on it, or it will be difficult to get stuff to stick to it. Always wash your balls, people, it's important. #life advice. I drilled a hole in the ball and put it on a cocktail stick for easier handling. Then I drew on the major axis on it with a permanent marker to help me align the sculpt. You might also want to rough up the surface with some sandpaper to help the putty stick better, and I didn't do that here though. To build up the surface detail, I used a mixture of Milliput and Play-doh, one part of each. This mix is really a game changer as it makes the putty softer and extends the working time. The mix sets hard after about 8 hours, but it starts to lose its sackiness around the 6-hour mark. If you keep working it past this point, it will crumble. Just leave it alone a little longer and you're good. I used some Vaseline to lubricate my sculpting tools as I worked. This makes it even easier to work with the putty. Earthmanbrick has been suggesting this for some time and I recently found out that Milliput is corrosive. Although I haven't experienced any issues in the years of working with it, licking your tool is not a great idea. Whoa, lots of life advice in this video. To make the central eye, I pressed a blob of putty into place and smoothed it into a hemisphere. Then I did 2 rows, one above and one below, and smoothed them in to make the first part of the eyelid. I also pressed in the corners of the eyes. At this point I also added a mouth on the other end, but it looked a bit too much like a butthole, so I ditched that. I don't know how beholders poop. They might teleport bricks of solid gold straight out of their bodies for all I know. On the back side I built up 10 nubs. These would be the attachment points for the tentacles. I tried to keep them roughly similar in shape and size, but there's no reason to be too precise. Some variation helps sell the weirdness. One thing to keep in mind here is that we will want to drill into these later, so make sure that they have some bulk and there's a flattish surface for the drill to bite into. Back on the front, I added another pair of rolls to the eyelids and blended them to make a crease. Then I started to build up a shell around the eye by making rings of putty around it and blending them in. You want to keep a fairly sharp edge between the eye and the shell, and at the outer edge of the shell. To make the shell look pitted, I used the handle of a brush to poke a lot of small dents into it. Then I used a sharp blade to make some nicks and cuts here and there. I left this to set and started to make some tentacles. These are just lengths of paper clip with a leaf-shaped piece of putty on top. I also added an eye in each tentacle. This was done in the same way as the main eye, but of course it's smaller. I wanted the body to have some kind of a scaly layer, so I covered it in small balls of putty and blended them together. This created a lot of variety in sizes and angles. Next, I bent the tentacles around to make them look like they were moving around, and drilled some holes into the knobs. Then I superglued most of them into place, leaving a few off so I would have space to work. Trying to get putty to stick to bare wire is not a lot of fun, so I put a bit of superglue on it to make it a bit rougher. This helps stop the putty from spinning around on it. Then I build up the tentacles by pressing some putty around the wire and blending it in with the knobs. From there it's just a case of adding more putty and spreading it out towards the end. I'm not totally satisfied with how these turned out because they're a little rough. We'll need to do a bit more work on tentacle making. Once the first set of tentacles was done, I glued in and built up the rest and left it to set. And just like that it was ready to paint. I started off with my usual white on grey undercoat and painted the eye and eyelids and tentacles a light flesh colour, adding some blue to the tips of the tentacles. Then I started to paint the body with very thin layers of ultramarine blue and cyan. These two colours really take advantage of the colour of the undercoat, and building them up in thin layers leaves a good lighting effect with minimal effort. Next, I dry brushed some browns on the bottom half of the mini. I held it upside down so it would catch the opposite sides of the detail than the highlighting I would add later. I also darkened the eyelids with some sepia and started to dry brush up the scales and the shell. Lots of dry brushing. One thing I tried out here was something I picked up from John Hosenfeld over on the Crazy Crafter livestream. I diluted some phthalo green using 99% alcohol and used it to shade some of the recesses on the shell. The effect is really subtle and the camera doesn't pick it up very well, but I will definitely be doing some more experiments with it. Next, I cleaned up and highlighted the eyelids, and painted the eyeball white. After I gave the first coat, I decided that the blue and pink peeking up from under the white looked good, probably even better than a perfect coat would look. So I left it like this and started to paint the iris. This is really easy. Start out with a circle of purple. If you want a different colored iris, just pick a very dark shade of whatever color you want. This will be the outer diameter of the iris. I also put a dot in the center for reference, but this is not necessary. Next, I started to stipple in some reds and a tiny bit of yellow ochre, or whatever color you want the eye to be. The idea here is not to make a flat coat, but to have lots of tiny lines of color. I also refined the outline a little with the original purple. When that dries off, dot the pupil with some black and put on a couple of dots in to represent the light reflecting off. Since the rest of the eyeball isn't pure white, I also did some more white on top of it, so it would look more reflective. And that is really it for the eye. The flesh tone on the tentacles got reinforced, and I blended in the transition between the pink and the blue. Then I did null oil to the area with the scales, and while that dried, I lined the cuts on the shell with some light paint to make them stand out. Once the null oil was dry, I hit the scales with some more dry brushing, and started to paint Carroburg Crimson over all of the tentacles. I really like how this turned out, but while I was brushing this on, I damaged the gradients on some tentacles, so they looked weird. To fix this, I sponged some more flesh tone on all the tentacles and gave them another coating of Carroburg Crimson, more carefully this time. To finish off the piece, I painted in the eyes on the tentacles. This time I just painted the iris flat, since this is much smaller and the variations won't be visible. And after that it's time to put it on its base. I'm really happy with how this piece turned out, even if I'm a bit disappointed with the resin on the base. It deformed for some reason in the past week, even if nothing was touching it. Might have sagged because I mixed it wrong. Still, this is a piece I'm happy to have made. And that's it for today, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching this far and have a great week.